The train exhaled over Dry Creek's platform and shouldered on into White Country. Clara Mae Jenkins stepped down with a trunk, a shawl, and a letter pressed flat in her glove. She was a black, plus-size seamstress from Illinois, made strong by work and grief, lovely in a way the prairie understood, broad, rooted, unafraid. Jedediah Turner's neat hand had promised a homestead, a steady fire, and a life built by two. Snow sifted like flour. A station agent busied himself with a ledger. Clara set a trunk by a post and waited. The wind found her ankles and wearied them through her boots. A figure formed through the fall, broad-shouldered, hat brim low, coat powdered with frost. He stopped before her. "Miss Jenkins," he said, even as an invoice, and lifted the trunk into his wagon without meeting her eyes. He did not take her hand. They rode through town past the cafe, the smithy, and the general store window bright with tins and cloth. The silence in the wagon spoke more than he did. Behind his barn he set the trunk down. The house beyond hunched against the wind, smaller than his letters had drawn. His fingers flexed once, then stilled. "You're not what I expected." Clara steadied her breath. "Oh," she asked. "He said, you seem a fine woman," he said, gaze tipping past her cheek. "Only I pictured someone smaller, more delicate." He hesitated, then delivered the rest, lighter. Snow hissed in the grass. Somewhere a hinge complained. She thought of winters earned by a needle's wage, of bread coaxed to rise in cold kitchens, of a back that had carried what needed carrying. None of it would open the door he was closing. "I see," she said. "I'll take you back to town," he offered, polite as change counted wrong. He returned her like a misaddressed parcel. The trunk thumped onto the platform. He touched his hat. "No hard feelings?" "None I intend to carry," she replied. He walked away. The platform widened until it felt like a field. Rails drew east and west like paired sentences, their periods too far to see. She had no ticket, no cousin nearby, only rumor of a room above the apothecary if coin would turn the key. Cold crept up her calves. Tears came, plain, quiet, and unashamed, the way water finds a seam. She let them fall and did not hide her face. Cloth presses smoother after a dampening. When the shake left her hands, she lifted the trunk. Movement steadied her. Dry Creek stood braced against the wind. The cafe's bell wavered. The smithy coughed sparks. The livery breathed animal steam. The church steeple seemed too small for the sky. Faces turned, then away. Whispers stitched after her. Mail-order bride turned on the platform. Shame about her size. Shame about her color. The words grazed and passed. A town, she reminded herself, is a place to learn, not a judge to fear. The apothecary's bell chimed when she entered. A narrow stair climbed to a dormer window. A placard offered a single room. The proprietor's fingers were stained with ink and winter salve. He considered her with the steadiness of trade and said, 2 weeks, coin first. Clara untied the knotted corner of her handkerchief and counted out the last Illinois money she owned. The room under the eaves was small and drafty. The bed was narrow as a pew. The window framed a pewter square of sky. It was hers. She set the trunk at the foot of the bed and unfolded her mother's quilt across the thin mattress. The patchwork spoke of useful beauty, Sunday dress cotton, flour sack print, a strip of apron that had wiped generations of small faces. She smoothed the seams with both palms and felt steadier. From the window she saw the stitched line of rails, and beyond, the pale slope of hills. She laid Jedediah's letter on the sill. It had been a lantern. It was not a map. Tomorrow she would draw one. A card in the apothecary window, mending and alterations, fair prices, clean work. A quiet visit to the bakery between batches. A price for hems that matched a miner's pocket. A pie traded for eggs. Night came with January's discipline. Below, glass clinked. Outside, hoofs rang and faded. Clara banked the lamp and sat with her hands quiet on her knees until her breathing matched her pulse. Then she spoke, because a room should learn its keeper's truth early. "I will not shatter," she said, "to the quilt, the rafters, and the winter. I will not shrink." The words steadied the air. She loosened her boots and drew the quilt to her shoulders. Its remembered weight declared whose daughter she was. Tomorrow, Dry Creek would meet a woman who worked clean and took fair coin, who walked with her shoulders back and her needle sharp. Tonight she granted sorrow its measured inches and then took them back. Her heart, bruised but unbroken, kept time with the snow, and sleep came facing morning. In time.
Morning split pale through the dormer window, and the small room above the apothecary let in the light like a long-held breath. Clara rose before the town fully remembered itself, set water to warm on the iron plate, and arranged her tools as if laying out a service: needles in a saucer, beeswax, chalk, and a tape that had measured 100 bodies and would learn 100 more. She was a black, plus-size seamstress in a frontier place that preferred its lines narrow and its colors pale, yet she moved as if the space already belonged to her. She shook out her mother's quilt, folded it to the foot of the bed, and told herself a simple truth spoken to rafters in winter: she would make a life here. She wrote a neat card and pinned it to the apothecary door with a straight pin that refused to bend: mending and alterations, fair prices, clean work. Then she lifted her basket and stepped into a morning so sharp it made the teeth ache. The bakery was first. Mrs. Pickens stood dusted with flour, warm as an oven door. "You're the new seamstress," she said, as if ushering Clara into a space Dry Creek had been keeping. A work apron needed hemming. Clara promised it by evening and accepted a paper sack of day-old rolls in barter. "Come by any time," the baker added. "There's comfort enough for two in a warm kitchen." By noon the sign had worked its quiet spell. A miner's wife arrived with a skirt split along the placket. A freckled boy thrust forward, knees white with wear, and asked whether patches counted as shame or brag. Clara told him both could be true, and stitched sturdy squares that made his grin jump like a fish. The blacksmith's wife followed, sleepless and practical, her sleeves too tight for winter layers. "Let out and re-sewn," she said, "so you can breathe and lift." Coins clicked on the table, bright as yeses. Work moved through her hands and turned strangers into neighbors by the simple rite of fitting cloth to the bodies that lived inside it. The room began to smell of soap and warm wool, the intimate scent of hours made useful. Between seams she set pastry dough to rest on the sill and frowned it into pies she traded for eggs and flour. She saved string, folded paper, counted copper. Each small economy was a stitch, every stitch pronounced she would stay. When the apothecary carried up a chipped kettle and a pinch of peppermint, she mended his wife's shawl in return and left a pie on the counter without inventorying the kindness. Whispers threaded after her when she went to market. They mentioned the platform, the man at the barn, the insult shaped like preference. Some spoke low pity, others rough judgment, and a few that thin curiosity that cuts deeper than either. She kept her chin level and let her work answer. A hem straightened. A coat settled right on a belly that earned its ease. A Sunday dress no longer pinched a broad back that needed bread for 10 mouths. Men tipped hats because their shirts fit again. Women lingered because she pinned without pinching and listened without prying. By evening, her fingers ached in the useful way that means a day has been paid for. On the second Saturday, snow softened to gray slush, and the road to the livery threw up wet at every step. Clara carried her list to the general store for thread and buttons. The bell announced her, and the smell of coffee, iron nails, and licorice met her like memory. Shelves rose in orderly ranks: flour, lamp wicks, bright tins, bolts of cloth she would touch only when trade allowed. Behind the counter, a tall man with spectacles lifted his gaze with the measured attention of someone who prefers listening to speech. He nodded once, not weighing her the way some did, and reached for the green thread she asked for. "Anything else, ma'am?" "Not today," she said, feeling oddly rested by the absence of scrutiny. She stepped back into the cold with a spool and a thought she would not quite name. Days gathered a rhythm she could hum: Mondays for heavy repairs, Tuesdays for cuffs and collar facings, Wednesdays for pies, because the bakery wanted sweetness midweek, and she liked to feed what had once fed her. Thursday afternoons were for washing and thinking, while socks steamed on the line like surrendered flags. Fridays she walked house to house, where children bumped her skirts and called her Miss Clara with sugared mouths. On Sundays, she sat in the back pew and sang alto, letting the pastor's good words pass through her like daylight only.
The general store settled into Clara's mornings the way a steady note finds its place in a chord. She learned the hour when the crowd thinned and the stove's warmth reached the front counter, and she timed her errands to that quiet. Eli Cartwright worked there with the careful economy of a man who liked things to last, precise in the way he stacked tins, unhurried when he tallied totals, attentive, without prying. He looked at customers as if sight were a promise he intended to keep. When Clara came through the door, he lifted his eyes and welcomed her with a nod that felt level. It mattered that his gaze did not flick over her like an inventory of what she was not. He met her as she was, a black, plus-size seamstress in a town that preferred smaller frames and paler stories. The first conversation that reached past price and product began with a book. A thin volume peeked from Clara's basket like a shy thought. Eli caught the edge of its cloth cover as he set a spool of green thread on the counter. "What do you favor?" he asked. He didn't glance toward the queue, didn't lower his voice to turn the question into gossip. It was plain curiosity, offered clean. "Romances," she said, steady. "Happy ones. I like to know a heart can find its way." He nodded as if she had named something medicinal. "I keep a few behind," he said, "on consignment mostly. I could set one aside next time. No charge." "Then it wouldn't be consignment," she answered, a smile daring one corner. "It would be kindness." "Let's call it store policy," he replied, and left it there. The next visit, a small package waited by the register, wrapped in brown paper and tied with butcher string. He slid it forward. "If it pleases you, bring it back when it's done pleasing." She took it with both hands. He had chosen a story about a widow running a boarding house and a farmer who learned patience, people who made room for themselves rather than asking permission. She read it by lamplight, the words turning brighter as the room dimmed, and returned it 2 days later, neatly wrapped again, a cranberry tart tucked into her basket in exchange. When he began to protest, she shook her head. "Kindness isn't for counting," she said. He considered that, then accepted the tart as if accepting a small law of the world. The trade became its own liturgy. She brought back the book, and he offered another. Always women with backbone and men who learned to treat tenderness as a test of strength. Always an ending that refused to call compromise a cure. They spoke quietly about characters and pacing, about sentences that felt like doors, about the way a paragraph could set a person down in a better place than where it found her. He never mentioned the station platform. He never said Jedediah Turner's name. If he knew the story the town told in fragments, he kept it, like any other rumor, outside the threshold. Others did not. Once a customer lingered too long after paying for sugar and nails, his grin wide with the boldness cheap talk buys. Mail order business didn't pan out then. A rancher changed his mind, so I hear. Eli's pencil paused over the ledger. He didn't look up, didn't take aim with words sharpened for a fight. He merely closed the book with one palm, turned it toward the shelf, and said, "You're squared, Tom. Next." There was nothing in his tone but the end of a transaction. but it set the man moving, flushing as if he had been made to carry his own words back out the door. Clara felt the small, grateful heat of being protected without being made spectacle. She thanked Eli with a glance, and he answered with the smallest tilt of his head, as if to say she owed him nothing for what a decent man owed the room. He kept a chair near the stove that winter for anyone who needed to wait while he wrapped parcels. One morning he shifted it closer and draped a lap quilt across its back. "Draft sneaks under the sill. Sit a minute while I fetch the buttons." It was a public kindness made ordinary, and that made it larger. She sat, warming her hands and watching him move with that quiet, competent grace that comes from fitting a life to its work. He returned with 2 kinds of buttons and didn't press a choice on her. He laid them out and let her eye decide. Clara began to notice the ways he listened. If she mentioned her thimble had cracked, a new one appeared on the counter a week later at the exact price she could pay. When she admired a length of ribbon, then set it down with a seamstress's restraint, he cut off a narrow piece and tucked it into her parcel without a ledger entry. "Offcut," he said, which was true enough to please them both. When she mentioned that Sunday hymns sometimes stuck in her throat on the way home, he said, "There's tea behind the stove. Peppermint loosens grief." And he noticed what she did not say. He never asked about Chicago or why she came alone, never probed the wound to prove it was there. He understood the difference between secrecy and privacy. One hides, the other honors. That understanding let her ease into view by inches, like a woman stepping into a river and trusting it not to pull too hard. Dry Creek watched. A few faces tightened when Eli's courtesy refused to shrink at their disapproval. Most softened. People recalibrated. They often do when decency has the stubbornness to be seen. Children began to call her Miss Clara in the store, tugging at her skirts to show a marble or a gap-toothed grin. Eli kept jars of licorice sticks at eye level for small hands and never looked surprised when 3 pennies turned into 2. He had the precise generosity of a man who expected goodness to be taught by example. Late one afternoon, closing hour near, he wrapped a parcel of thread and molasses and paused before tying the knot. "This place feels different when you're here," he said, not as flattery, but as a field report from his own heart. She held the words in, then let them find their shape. "Different how?" "Quieter," he answered, smiling as if quiet were a compliment. "Or maybe I am." She took the parcel and did not rush to hide her answering smile. Outside, the sky leveled into pewter. Inside, the stove sighed and the floorboards learned their evening creak. The town would keep its opinions, and the winter would keep its edge. But the hours around the counter had begun to warm, and warmth, once it finds a seam, travels.
She finished the quilt by lamplight, setting the final knot like a decision made permanent. Each square held proof. Bakery gingham from Mrs. Pickens' retired apron, a strip from the brown dress she wore the day the platform did not break her, a patch from the blacksmith's wife's sleeve let out so winter layers could fit, a narrow ribbon the shade Eli once admired. Morning came sharp and bright. She wrapped the quilt in brown paper, tied it with saved twine, and carried the bundle through Dry Creek at a steady pace, past faces that had learned her name and a few that still recalculated at the sight of a black, plus-size woman unwilling to be less. The bell over the general store door chimed. Eli looked up, pushed his spectacles, and softened when he saw what she held. He stepped from behind the counter. "Miss Jenkins." "I brought something for the stove-side chair," she said, laying the parcel down. He undid the twine and unfolded the paper. His fingers moved along seams and paused where old cloth met new. "You made this?" "It was my mama's," she said. "I added our weeks." His voice lowered. No one's ever given me something like this." She met his eyes. "No one made me feel safe enough to." He rounded the counter and took her hand, gentle and sure. "Clara," he said, and the sound steadied the room, "you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." Beauty, she understood, was not the smallness a man once wanted behind a barn. It was the fullness of being seen as she was. Days lifted after that. The quilt warmed the chair. Customers said the store felt friendlier without knowing why. When the spring harvest dance was announced, lanterns went up along the schoolhouse eaves. Clara sewed a lilac dress with cream buttons like a quiet spine. She cut it to honor her waist and breadth without apology. In the washstand glass, a woman met her own eyes and did not look away. The schoolhouse filled early. Men in brushed coats laughed too loud. Women adjusted gloves with nerves disguised as fussing. Whispers traveled the rim like leaves along a fence. Some remembered the platform, some pretended not to. Eli stood by the punch bowl in a clean shirt, ironed as if heat could press out grief. He saw her the instant she stepped in. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room as a man walks toward water after a long ride. "Miss Jenkins," he said, bowing with more grace than practice, "would you favor me with the first waltz?" A dozen reckonings flickered across faces. She thought of rooms where she had made herself smaller to fit, then lifted her chin. "Yes, Mr. Cartwright, I would." He took her hand. The bow drew a slow 3, and the floor found its turning. Their steps were not perfect, but they were together. His palm settled at her waist with respect, not caution. Her hand on his shoulder felt like claim without apology. Around them opinions jostled, and then one by one sat down. Halfway through the waltz, she let go of the winter she had been holding. She still felt watched, but not weighed. Eli was not lecturing the town. He was simply loving her plainly, where people could see. That was lesson enough. When the tune ended, he kept her hand as they stepped into star air. Lanterns marked the steps. Beyond the yard, the prairie breathed. He stood close enough for warmth, far enough for reverence. "I never expected to find love here," he said, voice low. "But you walked into the store, and everything I thought was lost remembered its name." "I didn't just look at you," she said. "You saw me. I've been seeing you every day since the first." He kissed her then, not acclaim, but consent shaped into touch. It was steady as a door set true. Behind them the dance spun on. Before them the path widened as if the ground had been waiting. They returned and did not hide. He brought her cider. She teased him about his careful bow. The town recalibrated. Some mouths stayed tight. Others softened into smiles that meant maybe. Mrs. Pickens wiped her eyes and blamed the onions. The blacksmith's wife squeezed Clara's hand until both rings shone. Later, walking home under a sky pricked with stubborn stars, Clara carried the night like a warm loaf. The lilac dress breathed with every step. Dry Creek would keep testing, but she was not a test. She was a woman with a trade, a quilt, and a man who met her in the center of the room. She had crossed a winter and found spring waiting with its hand out. She took it.
Summer settled over Dry Creek with the kind of ease that makes even hard ground feel generous. The hills wore a soft green, the creek ran clear around its stones, and the wind arrived warm enough to lift curtains without rattling the glass. On a rise behind the general store, A dogwood spread its pale blossoms like quiet blessings. Beneath it, Clara May Jenkins stood in a dress she had sewn herself, cream lace that honored the line of her shoulders and the kindness of her waist. The gown did not apologize. It belonged to her the way sunlight belonged to midday. Beside her stood Eli Cartwright, collar a touch crooked, eyes steady as a surveyor's line. The town came as towns do, in hats and Sunday coats, with pies in wicker carriers, and children hard to hush. Curiosity traveled in, yes, but so did a neighborly affection that had learned its manners over the winter. Mrs. Pickens cried before the vows began and tried to blame a breeze. The blacksmith's wife dabbed her eyes with a square of gingham Clara had hemmed. The apothecary stood with his hands folded, thinking perhaps of the peppermint Clara brought when grief threatened to stick in a throat. Even those who had clung longest to old talk stood under the dogwood-shade and let the bloom do its gentle work. The vows were simple, spoken like truths set down on a ledger where errors could not hide. Eli promised steadiness and laughter, room to breathe and time to rest. Clara promised partnership and peace, a home where tenderness would not be taxed. When Eli said, "I never knew rest until I met you," the line rang plain as hammered iron. When Clara answered, "You reminded me who I already was," it sounded like a door closing firm on a draft. Hands found hands, yes was said. A hush rippled, then the cheer rose, high and full and honest. Someone whooped. Someone else sang one triumphant bar of a hymn before forgetting the next line and laughing into the silence. After, the hill turned picnic. Tables gathered like old friends. Pies lined up in ranks. Apple with sugar freckles. Pecan that glittered. A lemon custard the pastor's wife guarded like doctrine. The quilt Clara had finished in the winter, her mother's made new with small squares from newly earned days, lay over a chair on the porch, catching slants of light. Children ran a loop that began at the cider jug and ended in grass stains. A fiddler sketched a tune. A neighbor with a jug joined in. Joy found its footing and stayed. Jedediah Turner stood at the edge of it all, hat in hand. He had not the look of a man seeking absolution, only acknowledgment. When Clara's gaze met his, he tipped his hat, she tipped hers, and that was the whole of it. The town took the exchange on its own terms, not a reconciliation, not a performance, only two people allowing a winter to be what it was and then letting summer speak over it. Eli led Clara to the open grass when the tune turned sweet. They danced without import, without the stiff weight of proving anything at all. His hand knew its place at her waist as if it had been taught by months of careful practice. Her hand rested on his shoulder as if it had always lived there. Dry Creek watched and, watching, learned. Love, plain as bread, and as surprising, did its public work. Later, in the syrupy shade near the store, the two of them stood a little apart and looked out toward the prairie. The road curled like a promise. Inside the store, the bell chimed once for a late customer in need of lamp wicks. A cousin handled the sale while Eli let himself keep this hour whole. People came and pressed their good wishes into Clara's palms. Little girls peered at the lace and whispered future plans. Boys asked about pie, then forgot the answer, distracted by a grasshopper. The old men took off their hats because love made them generous. The old women took off their gloves because love made them practical. Blessings passed like slices of cake. When the last plate clinked onto a stack and the fiddler set down his bow, evening unrolled in a long blue. Eli and Clara climbed the porch steps and sat side by side, the quilt warm beneath them. A breeze moved through the dogwood and made the blossoms murmur. "This is home," Eli said, not as a discovery, but as the conclusion of a proof. "It is," Clara answered. The room above the apothecary had been first shelter, a harbor for bruised hope. This porch was the beginning of belonging. Life began to take its new shape in the unshowy ways that hold. The store kept its rhythm, but now there was a second set of hands at the ledger, a sharper eye for thread and buttons, a lap quilt on the stove-side chair that drew in anyone who needed 5 minutes of warmth. Clara added a small counter of notions that made women linger, pins in tidy wheels, scraps sold by the ounce, ribbons that refused to pretend beauty was a waste. Men brought shirts to be mended and learned to wait their turn with patience learned at harvest. When autumn came, she led Saturday sewing circles at the back of the store. Girls with quick fingers learned to stitch without pricking. Widowers learned to reattach buttons without cursing. Stories were traded across the table with the harmless gossip that oils a community. Who had a new calf? Who had a bad knee? Who needed looking in on when the first snow arrived? A place, once stung by its own meanness, practiced gentler reflexes. There were trials, because every year brings them. A fever season tugged hard at the edges of town. Clara brewed peppermint and lemon and sat by bedsides with the quiet competence of a woman who had refused to shatter. A spring storm worried the porch steps loose. Eli spent a long afternoon with a hammer, while Clara held the boards and the line, and the two of them laughed every time the dogwood dropped a blossom on top of his head, as if blessing the work. Grief came to neighbors, and the store became the place you went when you needed a pound of flour and someone to say your loved one's name out loud. Joy came, too, tucked in christening bonnets Clara hemmed with stitches so fine they looked like light. Sometimes, at day's end, the two of them walked the road that skirted the creek. The prairie pulled its long trick of looking like sea. They spoke of building a back room, of planting a pear tree, of maybe fostering a child if a child needed a landing. They spoke of nothing at all and let the sound of their steps declare enough. If any passerby had asked for a moral, Dry Creek could have offered one without sermon. Love had not arrived to rescue a damsel or to excuse a man. It had arrived to stand in the open and make a life in public view, steady, ordinary, lovely as sunrise on a workday. The town, with all its habits, learned to make room for that. The woman at its center did not shrink to fit the room grew, and under the dogwood, come spring or storm, two people kept choosing each other with the practical tenderness that wears well. When lanterns were lit and the store's bell made its last small announcement, Clara laid the quilt on the porch chair and smoothed a seam. The day had been long with newness, but it folded neatly into the stack of days to come. She and Eli stood, fingers laced, and stepped inside their house. Outside, the blossoms breathed in the dark. Inside, love took off its coat and stayed.